Hello, hello. We are very happy to be here again for the third day of Let There Be Lumbung. And just two quick notes, we are streaming online, so welcome to our friends that are watching us online. And also, just want to say if you need a receiver for German translation, the boxes are there. And during the break, I think it's good to return, or if you want to keep it for the second talk of the day. Without further ado, I want to introduce Mirwan Nandan from Ruang Grupa that will introduce the guest of the day. Thank you.
Check. Yeah. Thank you, Felipe Steinberg, to open this today's third day session on Let There Be Lumbung. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank the people who are making this possible, Felipe Steinberg, Alicia and the team, and also Undin Schaefer, our international sign, and also our team from Tondirect, and also our simultaneous translator. I'm also want to thanking you all to contribute your time to sit here in this room, to join us again in this third day of Let There Be Lumbung, to converse about the origin of Lumbungs, where it comes from, and then its potentialities, and then its social and historical context, repercussion, and its how its possibilities beyond Documenta 15, beyond 100 days of Documenta 15. And today, we are going to converse by two of our guests. First is Hilmar Farid and our dear friend Nikos Papastergiadis. Hilmar Farid is now online with us. He is sitting now in Jakarta, Western Indonesian time, which is 9 p.m. now in there. He's now with us. Hilmar will talk about Lumbung as a Lumbung as a cultural tide turns, and cultural tide turns Lumbung as a movement. Hilmar is a historian and also scholars. He and also at the same time a cultural worker. He has been involving in art and cultural activism since late 80s up until today. He went to Universitas Indonesia in Jakarta to study history, and then he continued to have PhD from National University of Singapore. In 90s, he was part of editorial team of a publication called Media Kerja Budaya, or cultural media of cultural work, as part of the program of Jaringan Kerja Budaya, or Cultural Worker Network. And then he has been part of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies community, and also he has been presenting his works in many places in the world, but also including in many places in Indonesia itself. His works also can be read from his website, hilmarfarid.id, and then starting from late 2015, he is inaugurated as a Director General of Culture, Ministry of Education and Culture, Technology and Research, Republic of Indonesia. He's supposed to be with us here today, but then there was a very short notice for him to attend a meeting this morning in Indonesia, 22 September. I'm not going to be very long to introduce him. Bang Fai, please start. Hello, we can hear you, Bang Fai. We can hear your voice. One thing also I forgot to mention that Hilmar Farid was born in Bonn, West Germany in 1968. And then he moved to Indonesia with his family in early 70s. Yeah. To reconnect from Jakarta, so there's a problem with the connection, but we're waiting up until he's connected.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Bang Fai, loud and clear, safe and sound.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Connection here seems a little bit like shaky, unreliable. But thank you again, Andan, for the kind introduction. And also thank you for the invitation to speak at this conference, and apologies for not being able to attend the conference in person. I really wish I could come to Kassel and see the group myself, but then problems with conflicting schedules, visa, etc., prevent me from going. But I've been following the news about the event, and I've read key documents, read reviews by critics, watched videos and so on, and to have a better grasp of what is going on. And I can tell you that I truly share the excitement from afar. And therefore, I would like to thank and congratulate Ruang Rupa and all the participating artists of Documenta 15. So the theme of my talk now is about Lumbung cultural movement. And Ruang Rupa introduced Lumbung as a key curatorial idea. But soon we are to discover that Lumbung here, which means rice barn, is more of a metaphorical space and not a physical space. And Documenta turned from an art event exhibiting artworks into a meeting place of cultural activists, critical scholars to share ideas, knowledge, experiences, and practices. Not only about art, or not primarily about art, about economy, society, the environment, about social relationships, communities, and so on. And art here is an integral part of that process and configuration. So it's an interesting approach, which I think distinguishes Documenta 15 from art events that also discuss climate change, social inequality, racial discrimination, but still places art at the center. Yeah, it's so different from previous episodes of Documenta itself. And with Ruang Rupa, you can really sense of an aesthetics that is essentially anti-aesthetics. Yeah, It's an affirmation of art as praxis. And it has a critical view, as you may see from the document that they produced, a critical view and a standpoint towards global art production, and it also offers a different set of values and methods about how to work and how to an art event. And there's also an explicit call for a transformation of contemporary art economy. And Lumbung, as a metaphorical space, indicates the alternative market that is at the center of contemporary art economy. So while in the historical Lumbung or the physical Lumbung of the past, people would store food, manage these reserves collectively for the common good. And in the Lumbung of Documenta, artists and other participants store ideas, records of practices, experiences that can be shared to others. And in both cases, food in the historical Lumbung and ideas in the Documenta Lumbung are seen as commons. And Lumbung at Documenta 15, I think, is a starting point. But things develop into different forms and take different trajectories in the future. And I can sense, like, from reading what is available, you have here alternatives, conventional cooperatives, to peer-to-peer production politics, which are taking inspiration from anti-ideas, sentiments, decolonization, autonomism, and so on. No? So you can sense from that configuration that there is a notion or an idea of some planetary collectivism, yeah, which involves a broad array of people, but also, interestingly, non-human elements at a level, yeah, as was clearly shown by Jatiwangi Art Factory's Neural Agenda Summit. It was really an interesting idea to bring together non-human elements in that in this context from different countries to attend the summit. And the same project was brought to a side event of the G20 Culture Ministers meeting that I helped to organize, and it really found resonance with the villagers around Borobudur, where the ministerial meeting took place. So this is how I understand the Lumbung and how it works. So it starts with Documenta, but then goes beyond its borders. Documenta at the center around which different projects and practices circulate. One group at one point in one of the documents calls Documenta itself the mothership. Yeah, I'm really not sure if that's the right analogy. Yeah, if you really see Documenta as a mothership, but if you really mean that, there are still a lot of things to do. No? There is this idea about inviting participants in Documenta 15 to become members of, so that they can take savings from the Lumbung and pass them to their respective collective or communities with whom they are working, and eventually return their own harvest to the Lumbung of additional knowledge, experience, and so on. So the question is, does it really happen? Yeah, you may have the answer already being there, but I'm excited to know this idea and ideal really plays out. And this is, I think, something that we can discuss later in the answer session. But this experiment with the Lumbung, commons and commoning, is not new. Yeah, Ruang Rupa itself has been doing that since its inception some 20 years ago. Yeah, in Indonesia, local and rural communities, in particular, commoning practices are still quite common. Yeah, being replaced entirely by capitalism, and with the recent policies of social forestry in the current government and the acknowledgement of indigenous tenurial rights, somewhat regained. No? So the question then is, so in what sense is the Lumbung of today, the Lumbung of, that is now being projected at Documenta, different from all other previous, and what steps must be taken to ensure that the movement will turn it better? Yeah, this is, I think, a fundamental question that I'd like to discuss in this occasion. And I think one of the most important differences is the context, which is the pandemic. Yeah, the impact of the pandemic is unprecedented. Never before in modern history has the world stopped like this. Yeah, the social and economic impact of the pandemic is also extraordinary. It's never been seen before. The economic losses, financial crisis, job losses, and so on. A multidimensional crisis that creates a firm belief that things not return to the old normal. Yeah, and I believe that fundamental changes must be made. That's precisely where I think new ideas are starting to take roots. Even among the establishment, like the World Economic Forum begins to recognize that and talks about a great reset. Yeah, there is an Indian banker. Yeah, the other day talks about the need for a rural revolution, focusing on food diversity and so on. Indonesian planners in the bureaucracy, they talk about the green economy, entertaining discussion about the universal basic income, circular economy, and whatnot. No? Not necessarily because they agree, but because the old ideas no longer hold. So Lumbung here provides a space not only to excite ideas in the romantic sense of the word, but also to store knowledge and experiences that can be accessed by other members of the community. And it would enrich, of course, be enriched because of their participation. So Lumbung is therefore an integral part of the movement, a method by which movements can develop independently, but constantly be connected to each other. Yeah, and I think a key issue here is the willingness to be part of the Lumbung, which I think reflects a awakened commitment to sharing and collaboration. And there's, of course, little wonder that this all happened in an art event, which is Documenta. Yeah, it may not happen in other international events. And this is exactly why art is so central, and the reason why I think Lumbung is essentially a cultural movement. Yeah, art, culture, as we know, stretches the imagination, allows us to think about real different and a new normal, not a modified old normal, but a truly new normal. But okay, there is Lumbung as a cultural movement, but where does it go? Yeah, as I said earlier, that the original ideas are probably no longer determining future developments. Yeah, the movement has started and will grow in different directions. It may take different forms beyond the control of Ruang Rupa or Documenta itself. Yeah, so I cannot see a clear, which is probably good. Yeah, because what is important is that the circulation of ideas and practices have already begun. Yeah. Earlier, for example, earlier today, I had a meeting with organizers of major cultural events, festivals here in Indonesia, and I brought up the idea of Lumbung as a method, yeah, as part of the movement to better connect with each other and grow collectively. And it received wonderful responses, and I've seen many other Lumbung practices in different cultural and geographical contexts here in Southeast Asia. But yeah, again, unorganized as it may seem, I think the movement or the movements will take shape in response to the current crisis. So it's not like anything goes, let's see how it flows, etc. No, yeah. This is also why is it different previous attempts to organize, to mobilize some sort of autonomous organization. It may seem unorganized, but I think it will take shape in response to the current crisis. Yeah, there are clear differences about what we think about the future, what we want in the future, but there is equally a clear agreement that we cannot continue our current mode of living. Yeah, and the reason for that, apart from the traumatic experience of COVID-19, is also the climate crisis. Yeah, heat waves, floods. I mean, Europe is now experiencing that. Yeah, drought. Yeah, never before in history, in the last 75 years or so, this is the worst. Some say even that in the last 500 years, it's the worst. What is happening right now? Water crisis, crop failure, all of that adds to the urgency of finding a real alternative, a solution. No? And this is, of course, not without a problem. Yeah, we have seen many good ideas and practices in the past that were co-opted and diverted. Yeah, biennales, like art biennales, which initially sprang up in response to the dominant art market, is a good case in point here. Yeah, Documenta is, of course, no exception in that regard. But and the Lumbung itself is also not an exception. Yeah, so far, I have only seen a sort of a romantic reading of Lumbung's history, kind of a pristine. It is projected or imagined as being a pristine social institution of egalitarian, indigenous, or ancient societies. Yeah? And here, I think we really need to have a critical reading of its history in order to fully understand its efficacy and also its relevance for us today. I do agree, I think we all agree that Lumbung is indeed an important social institution, but it is not always within an egalitarian setting. Yeah. The traditional societies that are sometimes referred to as being who gave birth to this Lumbung, in this society, social hierarchy between the elite and the commoners is very rigid. Yeah, and it was precisely because of this hierarchy that colonial rulers utilized to expand their rule. And this was called the indirect rule. Whoever has read Multatulis, Max Havelaar, a very famous novel of the 19th century, understands and where he describes this mechanism of indirect very well. Yeah, so that is one problem. Yeah. Lumbung, an institution that sprang up from a hierarchical traditional society. And the second problem is that during the colonial period, Lumbung, which has functioned as a common, was also transformed. And here is a quite interesting history because it connects Java with Germany. I mean. In the late 19th century, the social differentiation with the traditional society is actually wide, yeah, because of colonial rule. Power was concentrated in the hands of the elite, and so was control over the Lumbung as a social institution. Yeah, wealthy farmers played a major role in determining what was stored, how much can access that, at what price, and so on. Yeah. Poor farmers, on the other hand, who might be the ones who actually harvested the plants, but since they had no land, they worked for the wealthy farmers. So the poor farmers were allowed to borrow from the Lumbung at a certain price. Yeah, and this is the mechanism that caught the attention of a colonial official by the name of the Wolf van Westerrode, a Dutch colonial official from Purwokerto in Central Java. And he saw this practice in the community as a good opportunity to develop credit networks in the community. Yeah. And he got his idea to develop Lumbung into a credit network. And he got this idea from the German Raiffeisenbanken. Yeah, the full name of it is the Genossenschaftliche Finanzgruppe Volksbanken Raiffeisenbanken. Yeah, a cooperative financial network. So initially, this helped farmers to avoid the loan sharks who would provide credit with high interest rates in order to further control the harvest. So he initially saved them from that. And the Lumbung, his project was actually called Lumbung Desa. Yeah. So that project was later connected to the village bank, the Afdeling Bank, and later really acted like an ordinary credit institution. So again, initially it was good. There was a seed lumbung, so a lumbung for seeds. There was a cooperative, a kooperasi, and since it was considered full by the population, it grew very fast. In 1905, like 4 years after it was after its inception, there were already more 5,000 village lumbungs or lumbung desa. Yeah. 6 years later, it grew, reached the number of 12,000 lumbung. So, but at the same time that these lumbungs developed, expanded its operation, they also became more and more impersonal, less collective. Yeah. And there was no cooperation whatsoever, let alone mutual cooperation. And it really later on became an ordinary financial institution. Yeah, people no longer stored rice, let alone knowledge, and those with more income then turn to village banks because the money penetration is so deep, and there was an increasing demand for cash as well in the society. So lumbung lost its original meaning and value and role, turned into something completely different. Yeah, so this is the story of Lumbung Desa in 19th century Java. But what can we learn from this story? Yeah, I think the experience really tells us something about alternatives. Yeah, Lumbung is not an ultimate solution. Lumbung is more of a platform on which we can think of solutions. And it also makes us realize that there is no solution that lasts forever. Each period will give birth to new problems, and we may continue to live with problems like that. Yeah. So it would be wrong, I think, to focus our attention on a one-time and a one-size-fits-all solution. We need Lumbung as a tool for cultural movements in order to be able to understand, anticipate the dynamics of history. And only by that can we make a true recovery from the crisis today and start to build a solid foundation for a better life. I think this is what I have to say. Sorry for the technical glitch, but I thank you once again for listening, and I hope we can continue with discussions about this. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Hilmar Farid, for your generosity in sharing to us the history of Lumbung from the perspective of a village in Java. But also it touched upon the notion of Lumbung, how we do it now. So it's very true that you said that Lumbung is not a single solution. It's a platform to find a solution. And Lumbung itself is not alone there, because there are many practices, or there are many other platforms like Lumbung in any places in the world. In many places in the world, like for example, our friend in Africa, they have a concept called Maya, or in Latin America, they have a concept called Minga. So yeah, thank you so much for saying this about that. It's a platform to find a solution to sustain together. And then we'll open the mic for questions and comments for all of us who are here in this room. Yeah, please.
Wait, stop. I have a mic for
There's a microphone.
Yeah, I want just to know if this Lumbung.space collaboration in the future is going to last after Documenta for several years, even in collaboration with Docutopia.
I think the question is very specific, and then we are discussing now Lumbung as a cultural movement from the perspective of our guest Hilmar Farid. Some of us from Ruang Rupa can answer this about this possibility, and then yeah, I can find it after this session to answer your question. Thank you. But yeah, we're discussing now with Hilmar Farid, who's talking about the Lumbung as a cultural movement. But your very specific question will be answered later. Yeah. Any question and comments? But to answer your question, that this Lumbung will be continued, including Lumbung.space. But about it will be collaborate with anyone or any collective, it's a different discussion and then the next discussion to come. Yeah. Any comment and question? Oh yeah, Pak John.
I was wondering if Hilmar Farid could speak a bit more about the way in which the Indonesian government today is encouraging or recognizing communal property rights.
Yeah. Bang Fai, there was a question from John Rosa about the about how.
Okay, should I answer that?
Yeah, please.
Should I respond directly to
Yeah.
that? Yeah, okay. Thanks, John. I think one of the most important developments is the recognition of indigenous or other tenurial right. Yeah, this is, I think, a major development. The president has introduced this program of social forestry, but which basically lends the land or the forest to communities to manage, so they can manage forests owned by the state collectively with social programs and so on. But this recognition of indigenous tenurial rights is somewhat different from that. Yeah, and it is significant in many ways because this has been the demand from indigenous movement for many years. So that's very important. But again, I think although it's a very important development, it also has its challenges. Yeah, once you hand over tenurial rights and you certify, you give certificates, land certificates to indigenous communities, there's always a risk that they will use it for a purpose different from its original intention. Yeah. And it happens already. In several places, people who received the certificate brought it to pawn shops in order to get cash. So on one hand, it's very important development, but again, a cultural movement needs, or social movement here needs to be accompanying all good policies in order then to be effective. Yeah. Yeah. So that's my response to that question.
Thanks, John, for the question. But also thanks to Hilmar Farid to respond about how Indonesian government recognize the commoning, which is not only in a rural context, but also it can touch upon in the urban context. Do you have any question and comments? Please. Microphone.
My question is, what would you say are the 3 or 4 key principles that would make the Lumbung more culturally adaptable in many places?
Yeah.
I think, yeah, so far the Lumbung, as it is explained by Ruang Rupa in the Documenta context, has brought up some universal values, like key ideas, solidarity, like working collaboration. So I think these are basic principles that would help the Lumbung as a base to be adapted in different cultural contexts. And as Andan said before, the similar institutions like Lumbung, they exist in different cultures, especially in the global south. Yeah. I'm not sure about how it is now in Europe, if it still has like similar institution like that. I suppose not. But yeah, in order to create that connection that we expect, some universal values or principles should be in place. And I think Ruang Rupa has done that already. If you read the key documents of it, yeah, you have that, yeah, again, like universal ideas of solidarity, like collaboration. Humor is also a very important element in that. So yeah, I hope that it helps to answer that question.
Yeah, to add to that, there are actually 7 values we identify during this process of Documenta 15, and then it will be continued beyond Documenta 15. Those 7 values are locally anchored, humor, generosity, sufficiency, regeneration, independence, transparency. Yeah, those 7 values. So that's also maybe the reason we have a 7 speakers in this Let There Be Lumbung talk series, coincidentally. Any more questions and comments? Yeah, please.
I actually would like to comment the previous question and express the total enragement by saying how Lumbung can be adapted. Do you mean you feel yourself a stranger to this? That's it.
Sorry, would you repeat the question?
It was a comment to the previous question and to the question saying how Lumbung can be adapted. And for me, it sounds as if the person who is asking the question feels themselves foreigner to Lumbung as soon as it needs to be adapted. I think it's so universal that it doesn't need to be adapted.
He responded to your question.
Yes, my question is related to the fact that, for instance, in Canada, we have something called credit unions. You know, there's some similarity, but it's certainly not the same. So I was wondering what were some of those principles that Lumbung, that creates it and that holds it in being, that would help understand how some other types of institutions could take on the best of what Lumbung means.
Thank you. I hope it's... please.
Thank you for the input of the history of the Lumbung. I have a question to Farid. It's about if it will become a cultural movement, what about the other elements, especially like justice, which has happened like past 500 years of colonizations and the reparations, just because if something becomes just a cultural movement in the world and then the Western world will enjoy again to being center or being, because at the moment there is all the resources and the money power they are holding, how are we going to redistribute this financial power to especially with the global south and because when we discuss the financial power, we need to discuss the justice, the colonial violence and the murders, genocide they create. As a government official, also as a cultural mediator, how you negotiate with your Western counterparts?
Yeah. Should I respond to that question?
Yeah, please, Pak Pai.
Okay. Because I cannot clearly see the audience, and my screen is too small. Yeah, so you're very right. I mean, if you say cultural movement, it doesn't mean that we try to avoid politics or power struggle and all that, which is, of course, a very important component of transformation, right? But by looking at Lumbung as a cultural movement, what I think the advantage of that is that you would, instead of like doing the old kind of power struggle with organizations, party politics, try to enter making changes in the government, try really a process from the bottom up. Yeah, you work among the people. Yeah, of course, at the end of the day, if the movement then grows stronger, you would confront all these issues that you raised in the question, which I think is very important. But then you would approach those questions from a completely different perspective. Yeah. Right now, I mean, you have all the formulas, the prescription of what to do and how to do it, etc. But we have seen failure after failure after failure and challenge that. Yeah, so new ways are now really only necessary, not only desirable, but they are necessary. Yeah, so this is, I think, where the notion of Lumbung as a cultural movement steps in. Yeah, again, it's not in order to avoid political issue of power, what you call that, like inequality, unequal relations between the global north and the global south and all that. I mean, that's very much part of that, yeah. But I think by looking at Lumbung as an open space, you might get wider support, yeah. And yeah, so that's what I think, yeah.
Hope it answers. Any more questions and comments? Please, microphone.
Thank you for a great talk. It was maybe a little bit difficult sometimes for us to follow, but because of the technology, so I hope I heard you right. But you said, I think in the beginning, that this Documenta was anti-aesthetic, but put art at the center. And that sounds like wonderfully reassuring, but I'm just wondering, do we need this reassurance still that art is at the center? And if it's actually not so that the aesthetics have shifted so that it's Lumbung as a form, as a methodology, as a metaphor, as you say, and all the other words and conceptual frameworks that these collectives are using, that are featured in the Documenta, that are at the center. And so I'm just wondering, you know, if you meant art in another way, or if we still need this centrality of art in order to have aesthetics of Lumbung and other collective forms.
Yeah, thanks. A very important question to which I don't have a clear answer yet. But yeah, I mean, art is here seen by ruang rupa, as I understand it, more as a kind of praxis. Yeah, instead of like to the traditional or conventional notion of being something beautiful, etc. No, and that's why I think the inclination to use ideas like artistic practices, yeah, which are akin to social practices, instead of art being something like isolated from other social practices. So that's, I think, where art still plays a very important role, in the sense of art being a praxis. Yeah.
Any question or comment? Or Pak Nicos, you want to comment, or you want to say something from?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the very illuminating lecture you gave. And you also made a distinction between the romantic and practical distinctions of Lumbung. Can you perhaps go back over the difference between what is purely a romantic version of Lumbung and what is the one that, following on from the last comment, I think, and also picking up also the reference from our colleague from Canada who said where we need to find other associations with Lumbung in other cultures. So I think it's very important that we distinguish between a romantic definition and a practical one, so that those translations and associations and connections that are recessed in our culture can become processed and more visible and more active in our place. Because, you know, it's very easy to oversimplify and say industrialization, modernization, colonialism has destroyed and displaced cultural values towards the land, but that doesn't mean it has erased them or destroyed or earlier versions of how to engage with the ecology of the land. So the reactivation of those earlier and more perduring concepts and relations to the land, I think is a very vital task. So Lumbung is perhaps a stimulus in that direction. And so the more we can see the connections to other cultures, whether they're in Canada or other parts of the world, that's vital, I think. And therefore, it's not just a romantic point, which I totally agree with you. It has to be a practical point as well.
Well, as I said, I'm clearly here referring to the key documents that Ruang Rupa has produced during its curatorial, when it makes its curatorial statement. But it's quite clear that the romantic idea about Lumbung being like a pristine social institution from an egalitarian society, which was not the case. The societies, the traditional societies that we are referring to, are hierarchical, and they have their own problems, internal problems, and Lumbung is also not a protected social institution that is safe from intervention and all that, as is shown by the case that I referred to in my talk, in the colonial office turned Lumbung Desa, the village Lumbung, into a credit bank. So it means that these social institutions are very dynamic, and I totally agree. I mean that we don't need to think about Lumbung as something being original, but something as being useful and relevant. And I think you can find it in many other different cultures in the form of cooperatives, cooperacy, like in Canada, and in other forms, self-help, mutual aid and all that. So the key thing here is not to think an ideal Lumbung as a model, but to think along with the idea of Lumbung. So to see the connections that Lumbung may have with other social institutions in different contexts and how they are related, connected, and not only in the normal or romantic notion of exchange of ideas, etc., but really looking at the connection, the possibility of making a long-lasting relationship between these different social practices that occur. Now, that's, I think, is the importance of Lumbung being a documenta. Because, as I said, like before, there are many international meetings, international gatherings, events, and so on, where Lumbung practices in different forms will meet. But here you can really find, at least in my sense, from afar, like looking at Documenta from afar, I get that sense of something is growing from the initial idea or the original idea of Lumbung, and now it has made like different connections. Things may move in or have different as well. So, which is very exciting to see. But yeah, and again, the connections are, I think, a key here. Instead of trying to find well-formulated notion of Lumbung, but let the Lumbung flow into different directions. We just follow and see where the connections go, and then start from there. Start building relations, start to store collectively our knowledge, our experiences, and so on. So yeah, that's my response to your question, to your comments.
Yeah. So we're about 5 minutes to go. We have one left question or comments, if there are any. But also we have some friends here, like our friends Minna Valjaka from Finland, who's now in Leiden. She has been also doing research in Indonesia for around 10 years. Maybe you also want to say, comment something based on your research, or what did you find while you conducted research in Indonesia? Sorry for the short notice to.
Thank you, Andan. And first of all, very much thank you for Hilmar for this very detailed contextualization of Lumbung through the traditions and the more contemporary periods in time in Indonesia. So yes, I've been very, very lucky to have a chance to look into the aspirations and wishes from some of the local artists and art collectives, including the younger generation next to me here. If you want to, okay. So one of these small remarks that I got from the locals is perhaps the notion of Lumbung, if we find it in a very traditional sense, seems to be perhaps not taking into account the gender matters, if I may say so. So some of the female artists, for example, in Indonesia, especially the younger ones, are slightly concerned where is their place, what kind of role they can have in these lumbungs and ecosystems, and do they need to build their own in order to be able to include their voices into these discussions. So I wonder if you might wish to perhaps think a little bit about these gender aspects, Hilmar. What do you see from your experience and research?
Yeah, very true. I completely agree with you. I mean, that's with the original Lumbung as well. It's a very, it's a male, basically male institution, right? All the important decisions are made. Wealthy farmers, in most cases, they are male. But the question really is about like, what about like young women artists? I really think, yeah, that they need also to create their own mechanisms in order to participate in that. So Lumbung is not only consisted, I think, yeah, my feeling is not only consisted of like individuals taking control of that, but also like communities, groups, collectives, etc., who might participate in that. And it should be, unlike the original or historical, it should be more open and yeah, again, gender sensitive, not to talk about disabilities and all these like different problems that would normally prevent people from participating in projects or social institutions like that. So yeah, I completely agree with you. What we are trying to do here in Indonesia is also to provide spaces, yeah, for younger people to participate in art projects and cultural projects. I mean, just now, I mean, like earlier today, I had this meeting for our new endowment fund for the arts. And there, I think there was a clear policy where female cultural workers and artists should be also given special attention like that. So it's all there. Of course, there was no, to call that like a magic formula of that. It's a process. It's a part of a social struggle where everybody is involved. But yeah, I think your point about thinking about the role of female participants in the Lumbung is very, very important. And I think it's also a very important note for ruang rupa itself in its practices, especially since it started with the idea of Lumbung to think about the role of female artists in that project.
Yeah, thank you, Minna and Hilmar, Farid. So we're already been an hour conversing with Hilmar with his topic, Turning the Tides, Lumbung as a Cultural Movement. Bang Fai, do you have a closing remark for your presentation?
Well, yeah, not really. I thank you again for having me. I really wish I could be with you, all of you, and see the exhibition. But yeah, again.
Indeed, that Lumbung will be continued, and then maybe we'll see you in person when it's continued. Thank you so much for your participation, and then also thank you for your time to be with us. We're going to have a break for 15 minutes, I think, 15 or 30 minutes, and then we're going to have our Nikos Papastergiadis, who will be with us here in person. Not he's sitting there, and then he will join us later after 30 minutes, and I will introduce him later after we having a break of this Let There Be Lumbung. See you in 30 minutes. I would like to, if you also may see in the website that the title of Nikos' talk will be The Crisis of Europe and the Future of Multiculturalism. Check. Yeah, thank you. We are about to start the second session of today, the Let There Be Lumbung, on the third day of this talk series and panel on Lumbung practices and Lumbung beyond Documenta 15. For all of you who needs a German translation, we are providing a simultaneous translator, and then you can have the equipment with our friend Lisa and Elijah this side. Okay, so yeah, we just had the previous session was we presented Hilmar Farid, and he talked about turning cultural tide, and Lumbung is a cultural movement. And now we are going to converse with our dear professor Nikos Papastergiadis, who arrived a couple of days ago. He flew away from Melbourne to be here, and thanks for that, because he has providing his time to be with us in person here in Reno, ruruHaus in Kassel for Documenta 15. Professor Nikos Papastergiadis is the director of research unit public culture, and also professor of communication and culture at the University of Melbourne. He has been visiting Indonesia for many times, whether to hang out or to do some works on research, especially for his last book published by Routledge titled L'Internazionale and the Crisis of Europe, where at the last page of the book, the title of the book is L'Internazionale, Museum of Common and the Crisis of Europe. And at the last chapter of the book, he coined that there is art practices that doesn't need a museum. Maybe he will talk a little bit about it. We're waiting, and then here we present our dear friend Nikos Papastergiadis.
Deep in the middle of Immanuel Kant's critique of practical reason lies the most beautiful of sentences. This is Kant. Two things fill the mind with the ever-increasing wonder and awe. The more often and constantly reflection concerns itself with them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. It might sound a little bit old-fashioned to start a talk on Lumbung and Documenta and ruruHaus by referencing old Immanuel Kant. He had his limitations. He was a bit of a racist, not a little bit, quite a lot actually. He was a very strict patrician, but he was also a cosmopolitan in his own way. And so I have one complaint, putting those provisos to the side. I have one complaint to make about our old friend Immanuel Kant. Why did he give up on his first love of the cosmos? Having made that complaint, I have to express my awe and gratitude to the impeccable display of logic in his account of the moral law within me. Let us remember that example that he gave to all Germans and to all of us for all time when we reflect on the conclusions that I will be making in this paper today. Now, in this paper, I have three parts. The first part is talking about the condition of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. I'm going to refer to that through spectral and zombie categories, saying that these terms are understood as a form of the living dead. In the second part, I'll be talking about counter-narratives to the living dead, which exist in the political discourse, by looking at the narratives of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism in art and activism. Now, multiculturalism is often seen as the policy that the state has for containing and controlling the minorities. It looks down on how to manage the minorities. Cosmopolitanism looks up to the skies and across the world to see how we can be cross-cultural, open, empathic, and curious with others. That opposition, in my mind, is reductive. Without the political accommodations, the on-the-ground stuff of multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism is a hollow abstraction. And without the ideals of cosmopolitanism, a multicultural reality becomes just a transactional management strategy. So in the third part of my paper, I'm going to explore why this transaction can't be held simultaneously. Why it is that we are killing multiculturalism and putting cosmopolitanism on this pedestal. And how that tension has enabled the emergence of a new racism. This new racism is not like the old racism, which had targets, which said that this person is subhuman or monstrous and therefore not worthy of conversation. And it was explicitly targeted and caricatured. New racism does something much more subtle and more pernicious. It reintroduces the categories of inferior and superior by realigning cultural values with geopolitical realities. And so it concentrates value with one group and blocks the allegiances and emergences of connections and solidarities with the multiplicities of groups which are attempting to forge a new cosmopolitan or multicultural sense of connection. So the world has become a very, very messy place. It was always a mess, but it's become extremely much more messy. And what the new racism is trying to do is to simplify the world in terms of these are the worthy people that we can have a conversation with, who already subscribe to and embrace our values, and these are the others who we can now justifiably ignore and prevent them from forging their own connections and solidarities. That's the thrust of my argument today. Let me now try and unpack some of these parts. And my first part is about zombie multiculturalism. When did this phenomenon come to be? Well, we can trace it back to 2010, when the three most powerful leaders in Europe all trash-talked multiculturalism. Merkel, Sarkozy, David Cameron, the German, French, and British leaders all announced that multiculturalism was dead. Having described it as dead, we then have a whole lot of questions. How did it die? Well, David Cameron at least could give us an answer how it died. He believed it died because he was told that the country was, as his Commissioner for Racial Equality, the black Trevor Phillips, said, the country was sleepwalking towards segregation. Similarly, private consultants were everywhere saying, we can fix the problem, but actually just filling up their pockets. And so, on the one hand, we had David Cameron saying, my country is against racism, but we won't allow segregation. My country is seeing that we're becoming more tolerant, but we are also seeing that that tolerance is enabling more intolerance. My country says we can have multiple attachments to other countries and other cultures, but that kind of attachment is creating a detachment from our core values and culture and identity. In that conundrum, David Cameron had allies who were promoting this position for over 10 years. And they came from the Jewish and the black community. Melanie Phillips, Munira Misra, at all found examples to show how the ethnic elites were manipulating the discourse of multiculturalism to enhance their power and detach themselves from the community. And so, with allies from the communities, someone like David Cameron could justifiably say, I'm against multiculturalism, and that doesn't make me a racist. Because I believe that everybody wants to come together in this way. We had similar views being expressed in this country with equal, and if not greater sophistication, by the great German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk. I won't go into the details of his view. But what I'm very curious about is why did Merkel and Sarkozy join in with Cameron and say that multiculturalism was dead? Cameron could speak to 10 or 20 years of institutional multiculturalism in his country. As far as I know, multiculturalism never became part of the official governance, institutional politics of either France or Germany. So what they were killing and announcing dead was something that never had actually been born. It was a kind of preemptive strike, kill it before it can actually emerge kind of a phenomenon. So we see this idea of wanting to destroy something as a way of simplifying the landscape. And it asks us, and also asks us to think about another question. Not only how did Cameron explain the death of multiculturalism, we now have to ask the question, what comes next? What will follow after the death of multiculturalism? What new kind of zombie will be born after this living dead phenomenon? Now, every humanist and even neoliberal urban historian or urban designer or critic will tell you that without diversity, no city or culture can thrive. Migrants do the dirty, difficult, and dangerous jobs. They also are the great innovators, creators, and stimulants to progress. So, in this globalizing world, everybody has to manage difference in a much more sophisticated way. But the reality is, the old ideals of purity and integrity that were at the core of national identity are hard to reconcile and accommodate with these practical realities of living with difference. And so this tension between the necessity for difference and the obsession with unified, coherent, singular identity in the national consciousness has produced conflict. And in that conflict, multiculturalism was the convenient scapegoat. Because in this globalizing world, the mess was becoming all the more transparent, and someone needed to clean it up. So, out came our politicians to clean it up for us. But in the process of trying to clean it up, they were doing two things that I thought was objectionable. One, they were rewriting the actual history of how multiculturalism came about and what it really meant and what it was actually doing in places where it was enabled, like in my country, Australia or Canada. So there was a complete erasure and defacement and sort of like a graffiti almost version of multiculturalism. But also, it was in contrast to what was actually happening on the ground. The political discourse was increasingly disconnected from the cultural context and the new kinds of cosmopolitan thinking and practices that were happening on the ground. So I want to offer in this second part a brief account of the activist and artistic imagination that actually enabled this conjunction of thinking of multicultural and cosmopolitan thinking. And also rewrite a little bit, I mean this will take hours, but I'll just want to indicate the need to rewrite what multicultural history was. in the first instance, in the 1960s, when the idea was first developed in Canada and Australia, it was not just this transactional idea of how to manage minorities, it was this utopian ideal of how to live with difference. All the early pioneers of multiculturalism had this combination of how you coexist with strangers, how you find ways of recognizing the value of other people's cultures, customs, languages, and practices, but also how you build a new platform that enables this recognition to come together into a new form of coexistence. In Australia, this was led by people from the Jewish and the Greek community. Walter Lippmann, from the Jewish community, was the first to talk about this idea of empathy through interaction. Not management of minorities to keep them in their place, to reward them to be different, but to develop what he called empathy of interaction. And as his niece, Helen Light, who recently passed away, pointed out, many of his ideas were drawn from his Jewish sensibility and culture and identity, but they extended further and beyond. They opened up to wider horizons, and he mentored many younger people who then went on to pioneer the ideas even further. Some of those people were Greeks, like a friend of mine called George Papadopoulos. And George Papadopoulos was trained as a lawyer, but he recognized that in the society, minority communities did not have an equivalent and equitable access to resources. And so what he was very keen to do was to see how, by using the principles of equality and equity that exist in a liberal society, you could open up a new discourse of cultural pluralism, cultural exchange, and an expanded form of cultural identity. So on the one hand, he was concerned about how to get access to the state so that these minorities had their fair share of what they were building, but he also had his own cosmopolitan vision of building a wider framework for people to coexist together as well. A similar vision was expressed by a poet who was born in Romania called Antigone Kefala, who said, "When I look into the culture, all I see, the dominant culture, and try to find a mirror that reflects back my identity, all I see is an alien." Out of this alien reflection was born this idea of creating new haunted or discrepant or contrary forms of identity. So out of this stigmatic condition was the inspiration for the construction of new literary and creative forms. She went on to also become the first arts officer in the Australia Council, one of the first arts ethnic officers anywhere in the world. But what these brief little insights and profiles suggest is that the emergence of multiculturalism always begins with both pragmatic and utopian aspirations. Now, that was in the 60s and 70s. Imagine how much more complicated and messy the world has now become. The great German sociologist Ulrich Beck talked about the cosmopolitanization of the society. And that prediction he made in the early 2000s has only become more valid and real every day we have had since then. But in what way has our political discourse kept pace with this cultural and social transformation that's occurring in our society? In what way have our rituals of hospitality and cross-cultural engagement been able to address the condition of encounters, the empathy of interaction that Walter Lippmann talked about in our contemporary context? Now, what I think is evident and obvious today is that the political discourse is going one way and the social cultural reality is going another way. And so what I would like to briefly point out to you, just at the same time that the politicians were saying multiculturalism is dead, and as Theresa May, the succeeding Prime Minister to David Cameron, said, if you're a citizen of the cosmopolitanism, if you're a cosmopolitan and you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Now, if that's her view, how is she responding to the fact that people are increasingly seeing themselves as citizens of the world? And this is a phenomenon that was becoming more and more evident when we looked at the art world. Just as the politicians were saying, you can't be like that, artists were becoming more like that all the time. I recall in the early 2000s great works by Francis Salis, Tanya Bruguera, who's in this exhibition, which were all about building collaborations with immigrants, the immigrant movement party that Tanya started. Shortly thereafter, the idea of world-making became a big concept in the art world, especially in 2009, when Daniel Birnbaum used that concept in his thematic overall of the Venice Biennale. I also was inspired by works by Trevor Paglen, which were in the Istanbul Biennale in that year, which were about celestial objects, this gazing towards the heavens to see our place in this new way. I recall conversations with a young Chus Martinez who wanted to rethink the intellectual cosmos, as she said, to get beyond the traditional leftist axioms and to open up our attention to new ecologies of art and practice. And with a kind of wondrous curiosity, I recall some of the final essays by John Berger when he, taking the example of Cézanne, said, "Color is the place where the mind and the universe meet." Hans Ulrich Obrist produced his book a few years later, Ways of Curating, as an homage to both John Berger's ways of seeing and Nelson Goodman's ways of world-making. The year after that, Eflux team started to introduce us to Russian cosmism, which is a wild idea of how we could live forever in the outer regions of the universe. The Institute of the Cosmos was instituted. In the Serpentine Gallery, Lucia Pietrojusti introduced us to general ecologies. Her mother, Caroline Christoph Bekakiev, during COVID, talked about the need for museums all over the world, this phenomenon was happening, of building a new kind of digital cosmos. And in the Global South, scholars like Eduardo Mendieta started to propose a new kind of conjunction between cosmopolitan thinking, cosmologies of the South, feminist ideologies, decolonial critiques to produce what he called interspecies cosmopolitanism. I give this very brief list of events, activities, and thoughts to indicate, to give a kind of broad brushstroke of the ways in which the art world was moving in response to this growing mess of the cosmopolitan multicultural reality that we were living in, and as a stark contrast to the political discourse which was somehow decrying the need for this and proclaiming the end of that, in fact. There we have this great contrast. Mirwan Andan referred to my book, and this is where I get to my third and final section of this paper, The Museums of the Commons. That was a book that was in response to the formation of Le Internationale, this confederation of museums across Europe, to do the work the European Union needed to be done, that it recognized could not be done through politics. Europe was formed as an economic union, but it knew that its political solidarity could not be sustained by the economy alone. They needed cultural cohesion to keep Europe together. And so, with this tiny amount of budget, these museums were invested with the responsibility of addressing the shortcomings of its own development and to somehow fill in the gaps and contradictions that were intensely being exposed and exploited every day in the national versions of the culture. But what we see happening is that there was this increasing tension between the need for a transnational thinking and a renationalization of the political and cultural context. And there was a desire at the local level to wipe away the mess of multicultural cosmopolitan thinking. Now, it's from that perspective that I've just quickly mapped out that I also want to come to the controversies that have almost threatened to undo Documenta 15. Last night, when Charles Esch spoke, he gave us an insight, an illustration of some of the stereotypes that appeared in the media when Ruan Grupa were first appointed as directors of Documenta. The assumption was, oh, I am a cultural critic, I've never heard of them, therefore they can't be of any value. How could they possibly do something that we haven't taught them how to do yet? So there's this constant stereotyping of the possibilities that these outsiders or others, they weren't outsiders, of course, this is but that's how they're represented, that these others could somehow take over the reins of the most prestigious art event in the world. Now, what they quickly realized that these old stereotypes missed the target. And they quickly realized that by caricaturing these people, that they weren't really bringing them down. And so the critique and the attack moved on to different ground. It moved on to what I'm going to call a new form of racism. Now, new and old racism are not necessarily in contradiction with each other. New racism doesn't mean you've moved up and left behind the old racism. The old racism still exists, but now it coexists with this new racism. And what both forms of racism want to achieve is the disappearance of dialogue. Because the old racism caricatures the other, vilifies the other, objectifies the other, so you don't have to think that you need to have a conversation with the other. Have you noticed that every time Andan introduces a speaker, he says, let's converse with this person. Let's converse with this person. Dialogue is at the center of everything we are witnessing here in Let There Be Lumbung. Old racism said there's no need for dialogue, they're subhuman or monstrous. The new racism has the same objective. They're saying, but we have superior values, and only when you subscribe and imbibe and embody my values, only then can we have a conversation. Let me give you an example of how that happened with our friend David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister who I just told you announced the death of multiculturalism and who relied on the advice of his black and Jewish advisors to feel confident that this thing was over, because in fact it was being exploited and manipulated for pernicious ends. Now, David Cameron could make these claims and feel good in himself, because he could also tell us that when he was at Oxford, he used to hang out at the reggae club. He didn't tell us that he smoked, but he said he maybe boogied with all the other people at the reggae club. And he felt that when David Bowie died, he made this incredibly emotional speech and read this obituary and said that David Bowie had written the soundtrack of his life. I don't think so. Because what, in fact, David Cameron was simply trying to do was trying to say that he was still part of hip, cool Britannia, right? So these things, whether it's pop culture or reggae music, exotic black food or different cuisines, once they can be assimilated and digested within my system, then it's fine. It's no threat. It's internalized. And what we see as a response to the end of multiculturalism was what he called a new muscular liberalism. So what was this new muscular liberalism that's going to succeed where multiculturalism failed? Nothing other than the old assimilationism. It was basically saying that, yes, we can have a little bit of that culture, and we can have these black people stand beside me because these black people are telling you that it's important that you need to be more white than the white people. So whiteness was being reactivated through this new kind of alliance with blackness. But it's a very selective incorporation to make this alliance. A selective incorporation that effectively neutralized any difference that difference can make. And we see how this kind of alliance actually preempts and neutralizes the need for dialogue. So you no longer have to have a dialogue with this black culture. You can just say, I boogied to it when I was a student. Now I'm grown up, who knows? But the point is, you can say, I've ingested and imbibed it. And we see another example of this new racism when the British Labour Party, very recently, was accused of anti-Semitism. And this was a very interesting point, because what was the evidence of the anti-Semitism in the British Labour Party? The evidence was simply what Jeremy Corbyn called an expression of the right of Palestinians to be able to live in peace. Now, if that is anti-Semitism, that means a criticism of Israel's policies, which are oppressive to other people, is equivalent to anti-Semitism. It conflates a criticism of the Israeli state with a condemnation of Jewish people and culture and religion. Let's come back to what is the inference. This is what Stuart Hall called inferential racism. What is the inference here? What is the mingling and intermingling that racisms, old and new, are producing when these kinds of conflations are being promoted and circulated? What is being mobilized in this situation? Now, I think this phenomenon that I've just described, both from Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn, are relevant when we think about the situation of Documenta 15. Because we see once again the attempt to produce a conflation, an equivalence between one state and another. Let me read you how the scientific advisory panel appointed by the Supervisory Board of Documenta made a critique of this exhibition. Let me read this statement, which no longer relies on the old racism of objective vilification, but mobilizes a new kind of subjective mood which relies on this conflation. This is their words. Serious problems of Documenta 15 consist not only in the presentation of isolated works, these are the objective things, with anti-Semitic imagery and statements, but also in a curatorial and organizational structural environment that has allowed an anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, and anti-Israeli mood to prevail. Now, the directors, the participating artists, the finding committee of the artistic direction of Documenta 15, they all protested vigorously that what we were witnessing in this kind of statement was nothing more than the half-truths spun into a web of smears and slanders. Half-truths spun into webs of smears and slanders. Because let's think about this conflation and how it produces an allowance of a mood. Let's assume a mood exists. What is the instrument that these scientists have used to identify and measure such a mood? As far as I'm aware, musicians create a mood through ambience. Brian Eno is a genius of this. Scientists have talked about the need for field perspective in order to recognize the way in which theoretical physics actually operates. But as far as I'm concerned, no social scientist has invented a technique yet to measure mood. It's like measuring smoke. Of course you can smell it, but who knows how much it actually weighs and where it will end up. So finding an algorithm to capture the mood, yes, that still is the wet dream of AI engineers. But as far as I know, reading a room is not as simple as pattern recognition or mapping the neural pathways. So, sure, social scientists have drawn from psychology to see how moods affect the psyche of a nation. We know about anxious nations. We know about shifts in the temperature of cultures, etc. And we know that we have moved from fear, thinking about objective things, oh, that dog will bite me, I have a fear of dogs, to having an anxiety which is not about the objective thing, but it is about the anticipation that something may hurt me. This is what Freud called that still to be discovered dimension of anxiety. Anxiety is not just the confrontation with the object that is actually going to do harm to you, but the anticipation, the still to be discovered element that will do harm to you. So social scientists have done quite a bit of work to try and see how this can infect the psyche and culture of a nation. But to call it scientific is a big stretch. What we have found is that you can think about ambience, you can think about moods, you can think about atmospheres, but what you are thinking about when you are doing that is thinking about complexity, which has multiple sources of interaction and multiple trajectories which are constantly in some dynamic interplay. Now, when you acknowledge that turbulence and multiplicity and complexity, you're a long way from the linear and categorical causal connections that were at play when we made the judgments about the life and death of multiculturalism. In fact, our good friend Immanuel Kant would be horrified to think that you can use that logic of mood to understand the principles of hospitality. And similarly, he would say that you can never exempt one group of people from a universal set of principles. Because the concept of hospitality in Kant was never defined in this exclusivist way. It's only valid for these people, or in this competitive way where it's more valid for some than others. Because if you protect one minority from abuse by saying their state is exempt from critique, then you have no capacity for rational evaluation. All you have to do is take everything on its name. And at the same time, once you exempt something, you also undermine the fact that freedom of one minority must be the same freedom for all minorities. If you have special freedoms for some minorities which are not applied to all other minorities, then no one has freedom. You only have temporary freedom. And so the curatorial team of Documenta, 15, have pointed out that and argued very strongly that their agenda is not about anti-Semitism. On the contrary, they've argued vigorously that a new kind of consciousness of solidarity across differences is occurring, which includes the Palestinian rights and issues. But it includes them amongst many other multiple and diverse minorities. And what is important is that that transversal, cosmopolitan, multicultural way of thinking about the world is a much more inclusive and not competitive and exclusivist vision. It's saying that solidarity is true for all, not only for some. And to think that what we have before us is an exercise in anti-Semitism is not an accidental, misguided error. And I don't think it's a mischievous slur or attention-seeking behaviour by some journalists. I think it's a deliberate attempt to abandon the cosmopolitan project, which was at the heart of projects like Documenta, and an attempt to realign projects like this into a different kind of geopolitical reality, away from the messy world that we're living in, into a much more tactical, strategic world. Now, I began by quoting Kant. Let me end this lecture now with a rather more quirky cosmopolitan. That's Michel de Montaigne. Michel de Montaigne was a magistrate who, near the end of his life, decided to retire to his father's castle and write some of the most beautiful essays ever written. In one essay, which is about the eros of the lame, he also talks about the limits of judgment. And he's talking about a situation where there's two brothers who are twins, and one passes off for the other, and the judge has to find which of these two is guilty. And there is a risk, as you know, like it's like when you read Montaigne's essay, it's like watching a Hitchcock film, because you know in Hitchcock films you're always terrified that the good guy is going to go down, right? And it's, you know, the good guy is looking more and more guilty as the situation, and you think he's the one that's going down. And this is the conundrum that Montaigne is actually talking about. What do you do when you think I might get it wrong and I am the judge? He finds a solution by appealing to an ancient Greek principle, where the judges, when they are perplexed by a matter, come up with this very interesting order. They make two orders, in fact. The judges will say, in situations like this, we order that we do not understand every matter. We order that we do not understand the matter. First of all, there's an expression of humility. And then they say something even more fantastic. They say, since we can't understand it now, we order that the two parties come back for judgment in 100 years' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikos Papastergiadis, for your...
How do you do that? You're the only one who says my name correctly. Were you Greek or something in your past life?
Sorry?
Are you Greek in your past life? You're the only one who says my name correctly.
Maybe. So, yeah, so who said that, who ordered you not to understand the matter? So it was the last remark I heard from your presentations, that many people who don't understand the matter, including us.
Yeah.
So because
we'll come back in 100 years and we'll work it out.
Because we didn't take the order to not to understand it. So we opened the mics to converse this room, of course, with Nikos Papastergiadis, with his presentation on the crisis of Europe and the future of multiculturalism. Because you said that the future of multiculturalism, it means that it has passed.
No, I don't think it's passed.
You said that the future of multiculturalism, it means, does it mean that it has a past?
Oh, it has a past,
okay.
And but it hasn't passed.
Okay, okay.
With a T and a double S-E-D.
Oh, okay. Okay, any questions or, yeah. But first of all, thank you so much, Utameta Bauer, for your visit. We knew that you just arrived, and then you
Now I cannot ask anything anymore.
Go, Uta.
No, Nikos, can you say something? Thank you for the presentation. And can you say something also for the clarification? Like we have the cosmopolitanism, where we are all like in this world, we all share this world. That sounds we're all equal, we're all the same. While multiculturalism allows difference. We can be on this world, but we can also be different. So can you say a little bit about this position, the cosmopolitanism, being all in this world together, versus the right of being different?
That's right, and this is why I insist that the two terms are seen together, because the right to be different is the right to develop your vision of the world. And that may not be the same as your neighbours, but that doesn't preclude the capacity to be in dialogue with your neighbour. So my argument is that multiculturalism is often understood as how local communities can be managed within a territory, within a state, and how that they cooperate together under a common legal framework, which is another misconception. This idea that the right to be different means that you have the right to invent separate laws. Now, no history of multiculturalism has actually revealed any community being given the right to invent new laws. That's a myth and a misconception and a fallacy that has been promoted by the right and which has been used to undermine the very principle of multiculturalism. Now, in my mind, that doesn't mean that the minority doesn't have the right to be in dialogue about the law. Of course it does have that right. But that's the whole point. That's the whole point of multiculturalism, is that you've come with your values and you've developed your own culture and identity and laws, but you then have to develop them again in relation to your neighbour. And so you have the right to be different insofar as you also have the obligation to be in cooperation with your neighbour, and that may require some overarching laws. And those overarching laws can be cosmopolitan. But the constitution of those overarching laws are not determined by one group, which then imposes them on all others, but the constitution of those laws is always formed through the dialogues of these equal partners. And when these partners are constituted as equal, then that dialogue is open and continuous and unending, rather than fixed and singular and predetermined. So that's why I think that it's so vital that we see these two terms together, because I made the point that when we see cosmopolitanism without multiculturalism, you have these nice abstractions, and when you see multiculturalism without cosmopolitanism, you have these kind of very territorial and petty fiefdoms where people are increasingly seeing themselves only in terms of their differences. So, but when you put the two together, then you have this much more radical dialogue about the possibilities of genuine reconfiguration of everything.
Yeah.
Hi. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I had just two questions. When you're talking about the mechanism of demonization and how you one-dimensionalize the other and how it extinguishes any hope for dialogue and so on and so forth, I couldn't help but think of Russia since February 24th and how the Cannes Film Festival banned a Russian delegation, and the Venice Biennale expelled the Russian pavilion, and New York City Metropolitan Opera expelled the Bolshoi Ballet, and there's this total othering of Russia, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts, because there's been a huge outcry from the global south, like Vijay Prashad and various professors, Professor Joseph Massad, saying this huge outpouring of compassion for refugees from Ukraine in the beginning, February, March, April, was in such contrast to the way we treated refugees in 2015-16 from Libya and Syria and so on and so forth. And Vijay Prashad asked this very poignant question: how come we don't know the flag of Libya? Now everywhere we know the flag of Ukraine. So that's my first question, if you have thoughts on that othering of Russia. And then my second question is a little bit different. I don't have any position on this, but I just want to play devil's advocate about your talking about cosmopolitan and multiculturalism. I'm curious what you think about the critique of cosmopolitanism / multiculturalism as being complicit with globalization. You know, I hear echoes of the Brexit debate where the professional managerial class, we're all cosmopolitan, we're multicultural, and we look down on the pro-Brexit people who are more isolationist, but it's very much a class divide. It's like a class privilege to be cosmopolitan and to be multicultural. And there's a critique that cosmopolitanism these people are the beneficiaries of globalization, you know, and the people who voted for Brexit were the losers of globalization.
Yeah, they're very powerful points you've raised. The first one is about the othering of Russia, which is also about the selfing of the Ukraine people. And the selfing of the Ukraine people we see exactly in the terrain you've described, whereby, you know, when Libya or Lebanon or Syria has a refugee problem, they're the others that we somehow adjust or accommodate, whereas the Christian Ukrainians were seen as proximate to us and therefore equal and worthy. And so that comes back to this distinction I was trying to tease open about who are the worthy people you can be in dialogue with and who are the unworthy people who you can tolerate a little bit, but you expect them to either leap forward into this assimilation or step away eventually. In other words, the selfing of the Ukrainians and the othering of the Russians, which was, and it's a huge other story, but I mean, and which is also been amplified by the fact that, yes, there have been so many other incidents where the refugees were treated with completely different codes. And those codes were determined by civilizational markers, which enabled certain folks to be welcomed and other folks to be seen as we can put up with it to a degree. Now, even in Kant, there was this sort of classification of how you adjust to the presence of the stranger and what burdens are considered tolerable and what burdens are considered intolerable and what duties are imposed on the stranger in order to adjust and be accepted in the state and how much the state should shoulder in these situations. So there's a kind of pragmatic accommodation right in the heart of liberal philosophy and political philosophy that sort of structures this dynamic of inclusion-exclusion. So a lot of it is to do, is exactly as you've anticipated, is how proximate is the self, how close is it to us, and how foreign or remote is it. And these seems like old caricatures, but they were mobilized in these powerful ways. And so you're quite right. In that sense, the caricature and the old vilifications of old racism were reenacted in that. The new racism I'm talking about is not evident in that scenario. It's different. Now, the new racism is, however, evident in the second scenario that you describe, which suggests that, you know, the problem with these Brexiteers is that they were all provincials. Now, it's so crude, because David Beckham is not my ideal of cosmopolitanism, you know, and yet he was the spokesperson who was saying, you know, we all need a little bit more Europe, you know, it helps us, you know, and all this sort of stuff in his kind of folky kind of way to promote the need to stay in Europe. Now, that kind of cosmopolitanism is a kind of top-down version of cosmopolitanism, which somehow says that if we're all educated, if we're all mobile, then we will express and develop a consciousness of curiosity and engagement with the world. So it presupposes that you either have the pedagogic development or the material resources to be mobile and engaged with the world. So you've somehow transcended your primal state, and your primal state is somehow bestial, provincial, territorial. So these cosmopolitans are the ones who've overcome their inner human nature. whereas the ones who are seen as provincial are just still in that animal state of one person fighting each other and wanting to build fences as vigorously as possible to keep the others out. Now, that is a view of human nature that I find Hobbesian, and Kant accepted it. He hated, he was quite opposed to Hobbes's view of the world, but when it came to Hobbes's views of human nature, Kant thought he was right, whereas he thought that Rousseau's view of the noble savage was completely fantasy and wrong. Now, my view is that human nature is a very conflicted thing. It is violent and destructive, and territorial and petty, but it is also caring, compassionate, and wondrous and curious. The great anthropologist Margaret Mead was once asked by a group of students, what was the first and most important sign of civilization? She said the discovery of a bone that showed that a person had healed from a broken leg 20,000 years ago. And recently, I think it was in Indonesia that it was discovered, it was one with 60,000 years ago.
It was in Maros, South Sulawesi.
Yes. So this was before Margaret Mead's observation, but the same situation occurs. So what does this broken bone tell us? Well, everyone who's broken a bone knows that it takes you 6 weeks to recover from a broken bone. So for 6 weeks, someone was fed and nurtured and cared for until they were back on their feet, literally. So for thousands and thousands of years, we've always had the capacity to care. And so that's in our human nature too. So my ideal of cosmopolitanism is that it is this constant struggle with the two sides of our human nature. And I forbid anyone to say that I'm only cosmopolitan when I'm rich and well-educated. I am also cosmopolitan from the moment I'm born, because from the moment I'm born, I have the capacity to connect and to care.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. That's what Lumbung also wants to do.
Connect and to care.
Yeah.
I agree, 100%.
Yeah. Any question and comments?
Thank you very much. I wondered, you've talked about crisis of Europe. Is it only a European crisis?
Very good point.
And I wondered if a philosopher outside of Europe was looking from it from a different perspective, and also a philosopher of art, or an economist of the art market were looking at it from a different perspective, if maybe they would think about it in a different way. And is there an alternative to this crisis, if I think you understand what I mean?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. And the reason why I stressed this issue of Europe, because we're here, I'm partly from here, of Greek nationality as well, but also because the European Union has this great contradiction in it. You know, L'Internationale is a beautiful illustration of that tension. L'Internationale is this confederation of 6 museums which are all based in 6 different cities. And they've come together because they want to work according to the principles of collaboration and local engagement. So they want to work collaboratively across the scope of Europe and have transnational networks, but they also want to learn how that transversal kind of thinking enables them to think more creatively and critically and positively with the local communities as well, which they call the constituents. So that's their aspiration. And they also recognize that Europe has that same aspiration, that the local must also be transversal. But Europe itself is struggling to achieve its own ideals. And so they invest, European Union is still a forum where these ideals of transnational solidarity are constantly being re-articulated, but they are being articulated in a context where the nation states still have the final word. So for instance, L'Internationale does exist, but it exists within the auspices of 6 museums, which are located in 6 different cities across 6 different countries in Europe, or 7 now, sorry. But it was 6 when I was doing my study. And each of those museums has to work with also state and corporate and private and public sector sources. And so the tension that they find is that on the one hand they want to pursue this ideal, but only 5 to 10% of their budget comes from the very source that says you need to work in this way. The rest is controlled by local or state authorities or income streams. And this is the tension that the European Union is constantly facing. That no matter how powerful the union may be, which it is, it still has to do with the fact that the constituent components have more power individually and in the local determination. So there is this phenomenal contradiction. So that's part of the reason that I'm talking about this. On the one hand, the crisis is really powerful here because there is a transnational institution that is trying to do something to activate these ideas, but at the same time it's coming against certain structural limitations for its own activation of its own principles. So that's why I focus on that. Now, in the same way you could say any federation has that problem, whether it's a federation of how many states there are in Canada or Australia, has the same problem. You could say Central and South America also has this challenge of how to work collaboratively and cooperatively with constituent nations. And even in Southeast Asian associations and so on. So this is not unique to the European phenomenon. You're quite right about that. But there is something perhaps institutionally more specific about the European situation. Now, what kind of imaginings can we produce from elsewhere? I think that is a beautiful point, and this Lumbung story is about that dissemination and that proposition, as Charles put it yesterday, of situations where different communities can come together to create these kinds of crossover connections and to create little microcosms of this cosmopolitan world. Now, I haven't answered the second half of your question at all. I mean, that's a bigger question that I could spend a lot of time, I would need a lot of time to really dig up to think about, because, for instance, in South America, as you probably know, there is very sophisticated thinking about the concept of interculturalism, which is a different interpretation of multiculturalism and a kind of critique of European versions of cosmopolitanism, because it's trying to bring together a cosmological way of thinking that is consistent with traditional cosmologies from South America, with a decolonial critique about Western knowledge and Western frameworks. So this concept of interculturalism is another example of this crisis that I'm talking about, because it's a beautiful concept which is much debated by a number of very powerful scholars, some of which is deeply engaged with local activist connections. Not all, but some of it has a very profound engagement at the local grassroots level as well. But that is just for the purposes of giving a hint of what other perspectives there are, is one.
Please.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm from the United States, and I'm curious how successful you think the United States has been at meeting their goal of being United States.
I have no idea.
Maybe I heard you refer to Australia and to Canada, but given that the United States is a very multicultural place, I was curious.
I see what you're saying now.
if you had any opinions. It's kind of a vague question, so there's no...
I know. I think you're trying to get me to say something that you already agree on.
No,
I understand, because, look, I've said that the norm for the world is multicultural. The norm. Where has there ever been a monocultural society? And is it possible for anyone to go towards a monocultural society? I can't see that happening. And as you rightly say, America is a multicultural society, but it doesn't, as far as I know, have a very strong multicultural policy or governance model in comparison to Canada or Australia, in the sense that it hasn't activated the kind of structural reforms that we've seen in other parts of the world, like Canada or Australia. And maybe I'm wrong, but there is a lot of debate about identity politics, and there has been a long history of promoting ethnic pluralism in the private sector and tolerance of communities, etc. But I'm not that aware of the way in which the state has invested in, to the same degree as other settler states have, in terms of the governance and execution of multicultural policies. So, you know, the cliche that is often used about America is it's a great place for assimilation, and that minorities go there to become more American, and so that's a cliche. So I guess I shouldn't be recycling cliches, but you know, you're tempting me and luring me into that space. And so I don't know, because I've actually avoided America to an extent. No disrespect.
But also we have maybe our friend John Rosa, who's still here with us. Maybe he wants to say something about this, or you had an opinion on this, John?
Well, as an Indonesianist, I was thinking about the Indonesian context, and I was thinking about what multiculturalism means within Indonesia, given the multiplicity of cultures there, and how Indonesia has dealt with this question. There's a common critique of government policy after 1965, which has tended to reify provincial identities. That is, every province has its own identity, or every sort of ethnic group has its own identity with its own cooking and its own dress, and Indonesia is one big happy family of all these different ethnic groups. And sort of the reaction to that version of multiculturalism, there's been a widespread rejection of that by the left and by many other people within Indonesia. But I was hesitant to ask. I know I just heard that you have been to Indonesia and you know something about it, but I was wary to ask about it. Maybe ruruHaus would talk about multiculturalism inside of Indonesia.
Yeah. The multiculturalism, we actually have a place called Good Kitchen behind Feliciano in the yard. That's where the Indonesian multiculturalism sense that maybe can be witnessed or can be felt. So that's what I can say about this, about how multiculturalism is, how to say, it's run by Indonesian. So, but also it's not only for Indonesian, but also for all of our friends who are part of this process, who've been in part of this good school programs in there. But that's where it can be, and also you can visit Jatiwangi and our factories spot, and also we have Agus Nur Amal's work in Grimveld. But the most important thing is to come to Indonesia and hang out. John said that when he came first Indonesia in 1994, and then the first word he knew was, one of them was nongkrong, which for me it was very surprised. I'm very surprised to know that when he came to Indonesia, the word nongkrong that we always use as a notion in this Documenta 15, also the same thing that he knew the first time when he arrived in the archipelago in 1994. So I'm not representing a minister of tourism, the inviting people to come, but I mean, if to feel the multiculturalism of Indonesia, as John and also Pak Nicos have been sensed it, is that to come and to hang out.
And the idea of hanging out is that you're hanging out with strangers, as opposed to hanging in a space that's discrete and unified and segmented, right? So hanging out means outward looking, right, as well as hanging. Whereas this idea that you're saying that the official version of multiculturalism promotes is a kind of hanging in where people stay within their segment. And then all those segments are assembled to form a greater unity, which is this whole idea of the mosaic version of multiculturalism, where all these components add up to a greater whole. And individually, those components can be as sparkling and as shiny as they like, as long as they don't intrude upon or contradict or challenge the boundary of the other, and conform and confine themselves and confirm the laws of the state. Now, that's not the multiculturalism that I'm discussing. That segmented and conformist model has been used to manage minorities since day one. The model I've been describing is about the empathy of interaction, this transversal equality of this idea of equality amongst partners, so that you accept the law, but you don't accept it as fixed and final or as predetermined by one group. And that if you are actual partners, then you have an opportunity for dialogue. And through that dialogue, you can reshape not just the content, but also the framework through which you coexist. And when that is possible, then there's equality. If that's not possible, there's different levels of subjugation.
Yeah. Any more questions and comments? Yeah, please.
Hi. Hi, Nicos.
Hi.
Hey, long time.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. 20 years ago, probably going to ask the same question asked 20 years ago, but hey. Beautiful talk.
Blast from the past, thank you.
And yeah, I wouldn't dare to argue against yours, and it was very well articulated. I want you to just say a little bit more about, when I first read The Crisis of Europe, I was thinking about globalization and global capital, and particularly the rise of China. And
the rise of
China, but India and the global south as a sort of economic powers in their own rights. And I'm wondering, I mean, it's a kind of abstract question in a way, but whether the rise of China and its possible cultural and institutional spread, what that potentially means, in a sense, to think through, I suppose in material terms, these changes.
Changes where? Here or just?
Globally. I mean, not changes, but the question, I suppose, of economic power in the context of political ethics is a bigger question, which I understand, but I'm trying to contextualize it in terms of thinking about questions of labor and questions of economic exploitation.
It's a very complex question, because it goes back to the question from the second part of your question about this sort of issue of globalization and multiculturalism. You know, Slavoj Žižek famously wrote an article where he equated multiculturalism with the cultural logic of globalization, and which permits a new kind of racism at a distance by reducing all cultures to objects for commodification. It elevates the role of the master culture to the one that surveys all these minor cultures and sees which ones it wants to pick and choose from, and thereby saying the new master culture is the globalizing culture, which reduces all other cultures to these minor roles and regulates and polices them, and can produce a kind of new distance from which it can create a new hierarchy of racist objectification. I think that's a conflation between the history of multiculturalism, which you know has a different kind of grassroots history, to the top-down version of government models of multiculturalism, which are completely contrary to that. But your point about China in this dynamic of globalization and localization is a very subtle and difficult one, because in some ways the Chinese have avoided the word culture in their spread. And they've not, as the Americans often do, say, we're here to promote our values. They say we're here to facilitate commerce. And we're not here to interfere with politics or to impose new culture. We're just here to do business. Now, in that sense, it's saying either culture is invisible or it's coming through some backdoor of the economy. And this is where I think we need a greater degree of clarity and understanding of what kind of culture is being brought in through this sideways. Because there are concepts of cosmopolitanism in Chinese philosophy, which is often incorporated in some of this qianshe, the term that's often used. And this is not visible and recognizable in many of the debates. So I think we're a long way from being able to answer your question, as far as I can at least. But I think it's a valid point to say, what is the actual point of interaction in terms of the cultural exchange that is occurring as the Chinese become a globally competitive and dominant force? What is the culture that is emerging in that interaction? I just don't know, to be quite honest with you. But nice to see you.
Yeah, Pak Nicos, do you have a closing? Oh,
there's questions more.
Okay, Tintin. Tintin will be the last question before
Thank you.
Nicos will give his last remark. Yeah, please, Tintin.
Talk. Thank you so much, Nicos. I was just thinking, if I understood it correctly, cosmopolitanism is an ideal that we strive to, right, for equality and everything. But the way the world now works with the system of nation states, that is sort of a model of multiculturalism, where cultures are kept, like if we see, like in a different layer, cultures are kept within borders, basically. So how do you think, in that context, in that layer, we can work towards cosmopolitanism? Thank you.
This is going to be a long answer. Because that's a big question.
Yeah.
It all depends on scale. If you look at the world through the scale of the nation, all you see is nationalism. Because nation states are very good at measuring how many people come in and go out. They know how much GDP occurs in their country. They know how many people voted in their country. So they've got evidence of national behavior economically, culturally, demographically, politically. But beyond their borders, they don't know. Because the tools stop working beyond their borders. That's called methodological nationalism, right? So when you see things from that scale, well, cosmopolitan is invisible. It's just an abstract ideal, to use your phrase. And when you see it as a philosophical idea, you say, oh, shit, look, in ancient Greece, in ancient India, in ancient China, and all the cosmologies of South America, indigenous cultures in Australia, they've all got a vision of the universe, the cosmos, the people, the connections. Oh, it's always there. It's part of our life, but it's never been grounded. Nothing's ever been built in its name. No one has walked behind it with a flag that says cosmos on it, as much as the Russian cosmisms that efflux are promoting have said it was just an idea. It never happened. But if you change the scale and you rethink about what I was saying about what is our human nature, then cosmopolitanism is everywhere. It's not an ideal, it's an impulse, not just an ideal, it's an impulse. I have the impulse to care for you. I might also have the impulse to kill you, but that right now I don't. I only have the impulse to love you. Where does that come from? It wasn't given to me through my education, because I don't think it was purely because I've hung out with you and I've learned to love you. Maybe it was, but I think we also have this capacity that's inherent in our human nature. And so if we have this impulse to be cosmopolitan, then the scale for measuring that is on a very micro level. It's not the meso level or the macro level that the meso is the national, macro is the cosmos, right? But at the micro level of our human interactions, cosmopolitanism is alive and kicking all the time. Look, there's probably 55 nationalities in this room and no one's killed each other. How's that possible? We obviously find ways to coexist. So this is something to celebrate at the local level. How we add it up and find networks, that's what Lumbung is for. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nikos Papastergiadis, for your for our conversation this afternoon. And then let's hang out after this.
Let's do that.
And tomorrow we are going also to have the 4th day of Let There Be Lumbung by conversing with Nuraini Juliastuti and Melanie Budianta. Nuraini is based both in Leiden in Yogyakarta, and Melanie Budianta is based in Jakarta and a professor from Universitas Indonesia. She just arrived at 5 o'clock ago, and then she's on her way to be in Kassel, and then she needs to take a rest, and then tomorrow she will be with us here in this room. Thank you so much for the simultaneous translator, Ton Direk, Undin Schiffer, Felipe and Lisa and Alicia, and also every one of us in this room who have been, and also the team who are going to clean the room after we leave it. Thank you so much for your work, and then thank you so much for all of us. Thank you.